while I myself personally in my nuclear family did not grow up in a working class family, um, like a working class household, the signs and the impact of Providence's own industrial decline were all around me through physical and the built environment, but also through my extended kin network. And the photograph I have here is of what's called the Seekonk River Bridge, which used to be a bridge over a river, which used to be to transport merchandise into Providence when it was a kind of hub. And what happened was that it no longer was of use, it was totally rusted, and it remained very famously rusted in this upright position as a kind of symbol of industrial decline. And this, for instance, was something that was visible, in daily life as part of Providence. And so in many ways, I lived with deindustrialization and its consequences as an extended part of my life. And so why am I sharing my personal experience? Because as sociologists, we are trained, one of our main trainings is to cultivate what's called our sociological imagination. And this is a term that was coined by a very important American sociologist called C. Wright Mills in the 1950s. And what Mills meant was that sociologists should be encouraged to take personal experiences and transform them in a way to grapple with larger social questions, that we should think ourselves away from the familiar routines of our daily life and look at them from a new point of view, from a sociological point of view. And so activating and engaging one's sociological imagination means finding a way in using personal biographies to think and understand the world, social world at large. So applying my sociological imagination was a big part of the genesis of the project, where I began to connect my personal experiences to a common one, to those, of course, in growing up and living in Michigan, USA, which is a very famous place of deindustrialization, but also to the West Midlands in the UK. Here I have a factory we can see in Birmingham that's been abandoned. To Pas-de-Calais in France or the Ruhr Valley in Germany, that this was actually something that had been documented for quite a bit of time in a very rich way through oral history or ethnographies and very rich qualitative case studies, but hadn't really been studied with such depth and care in a quantitative way. So I'm a quantitative researcher. And what hadn't been documented quantitatively was a notion that deindustrialization was not just affecting people who lost their factory jobs, but was actually having a ripple effect, a collateral damage on the lives of other people way beyond those workers, and that it had upended lives of working class families, but also of people who grew up in areas which had been heavily deindustrialized. But while this was a really common experience, at the same time, the common and everyday experience which many people lived didn't match the conventional wisdom or the dominant paradigm about deindustrialization at the time we start this project. So what's the dominant paradigm? Particularly what emerged in the years of the Brexit referendum and Trump's election was a highly reductionist narrative where the explanations of the politics of deindustrialization were frequently put in binary terms, terms of winners and losers, core and periphery, a phenomenon affecting them but not us. So what tends to come out was this notion that the deindustrialization first was something that affected men, male workers, male working class workers. And part of that was the attention that was put on certain industries like steel or automotive, and not textile or jewelry or other types of manufacturing where women had more role. It was put a lot more on working class occupations, right? So this wasn't necessarily something about a broader economic restructuring or about something where people who might have been middle class but living in those same areas still are affected. It tends in the United States, as part of the American narrative, to be seen as a white thing. So white working class male factory workers, and ignoring the fact that many of these occupations that had been restructured were actually held by minorities, African Americans or Hispanics, or women, for instance, as well. And it was also seen as a rural thing, a peripheral thing, something that didn't affect city life, something from forgotten places, right? Rather than something that's actually affected many places, not just forgotten places. And a final myth that tends to come from deindustrialization is something a bit odd because it's either one or the other. Sometimes it's reduced to a kind of new phenomenon, something simply as a product of globalization. And sometimes it's seen actually as an old phenomenon, something that happened in the 1970s, but doesn't affect life. It's over. We are already living in a post-industrial society. So regarding the latter point, I would just like to show the very summary statistics of this long decline. Here we have the share of manufacturing employment, which in the 1970s, about a third of employment in the major industrial powers of Germany, Italy, US, France, UK, and here we have the OECD average. So we could say a little bit less to a third, 25% to a third of the economy of workers were working in a manufacturing sector. Today in the UK, it has been really, extreme. The decline has been extreme in the UK. Where only about 1 out of 10 workers now works in the manufacturing industry. This has been the steepest decline. But what we see regarding the timing is that it was a phenomenon which began in the early 1970s, even late 1960s in the United States, that continued and began way before globalization started and really took off in the late 80s and the 90s. So this is not necessarily something just a product of globalization, but equally continues to decline. And this here stops in 2002, but the decline continues and has really affected almost all countries in the most advanced economies. What I would like to say about these numbers naturally is that the picture that comes from this very aggregate view of it is a slow, gradual decline of manufacturing, which we've seen a kind of rise of the service sectors, a very soft, slow decline. But this doesn't mean that this is how it is as a lived experience, particularly when we don't look at the aggregate. So something that comes from the very rich qualitative literature and some of the early literature of deindustrialization, which goes beyond this very simplistic way of thinking about it, is that deindustrialization comes in many guises. So it has many forms, has many forms to affect people locally. So it can be sudden, like the sudden closing of a factory or a plant, very an important event for a local community, or it can be a slow trickle where gradually a company shifts production to other locations, where jobs are slowly phased out through relocation or through automation. Or it can simply be a reduction in job quality, where those kinds of jobs just are paid less and have less benefits and offer less security than they used to. So it isn't just how many people work in this employment sector, but it has many guises or facets. And that's what we learned from Wallace and Rothschild. But these political implications of these many facets, at least from a quantitative view, have been overlooked. The other very important thing that we know from the rich qualitative literature on the cases of communities affected by deindustrialization is this notion that deindustrialization has a half-life. And what Lincoln says in this book is that, like toxic waste is really the metaphor that she uses, that toxic waste from nuclear production has this persistent and dangerous residue, where it wanes slowly over time. So does deindustrialization, where the influence of the event, of the decline of the share of manufacturing from the previous chart, may wane slowly over time, but it stays potent, and it can't simply, its potent aspects aren't simply forgotten or ignored. So what that means is that for people who are already adults, who experience this trickle, this long decline, who were living somehow in a society where this was part of their life, it brought a big source of struggle and conflict. So there were the labor battles, the plant shutdowns, the union fights, the pain of watching old mills get torn down, and then, even if not personally affected, watching people who were in your life get affected, like the neighbor that loses their house, etc. Now, those are for people who lived as adults through it. For those people who were born in the late 1970s and the early 80s, the half-life of deindustrialization, as Lincoln describes it, has a different effect. So these are not people who were displaced in the economy by deindustrialization. So they weren't displaced, but they were defined by it. They grew up in families and in communities already struggling to adapt with this, with social losses, constrained economic benefits, and limited opportunities. So for them, their experiences of deindustrialization, where they're socialized in this, are experiences of precarity, of uncertainty, and they are part of what we can think of as a ripple effect, where there's just this idea that good jobs are no longer local, there's fewer opportunities, and there's less stability. And so what this project is really aiming to do is to think about the political consequences of this long shadow, of these ripple effects, not just the factory workers who lost the job, but of the half-life. What's been the political consequences of the people who were still affected by the long shadow, but haven't really personally been studied because they aren't exactly those factory workers who lost the job. Okay. So by thinking about, the remit of RECET, I would like to say something about whether deindustrialization can be seen as a social transformation. And naturally, thinking about a social transformation, it's pretty obvious that it involves some kind of social change. But social change is maybe not strong enough of a word to describe deindustrialization, because change really is about cyclical changes and day-to-day life, life cycle events, and when we think about it sociologically, it usually has to do with the fortunes or misfortunes of social groups or communities. But social transformation really refers to more macro, fundamental change in the deep structures of society and organizes all dimensions of social life. And it's very natural to associate the phenomenon of industrialization with as a transformation. Naturally, I have here the book by Carl Polanyi, the Great Transformation. It's famously known as this, right? Where Polanyi famously said as a quote that at the heart of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, there was this miraculous improvement in the tools of production, which was accompanied by also a catastrophic dislocation in the lives of common people. So if we can agree that this was industrialization, was a great transformation, the undoing of that should be equally transformative. We could think about it as this great undoing. No. So just thinking about it and framing it that way, it's naturally, and Polanyi puts a big emphasis on the social side of it, not just the economic side. And that is also what we are trying to do with our research. And here I have various dimensions which deindustrialization makes deindustrialization transformative. And if we think about it as a social transformation, well, social can mean many things. It's all aspects of human life. So deindustrialization, while at its core comes from an economic restructuring of the manufacturing sector all the way to the service sector, and an occupational restructuring thanks to technological change as well, and offshoring. This phenomenon has ripple effects and changes on other aspects, on politics, which is what we will look at. It has technological aspects which fuel the process. It has demographic implications. Researchers have tied it to declining marriage rates, increasing mortality, these even drug overdoses, deaths of despair, and so on, decreasing fertility. And it's also associated, like the industrialization, and ushered in an era of modernity and the culture and the beliefs and the norms and the values which were heralded in modern life. Deindustrialization also involves naturally a cultural change in the kind of beliefs and the values people hold, even when it comes to political life. And so DESPO is really, we don't particularly look at the aspects of the transformation, demographic or technological, but are primarily interested in the intersection between these three: the cultural, the economic, and the political, and how basically people's orientation towards politics, particularly cultural change, changed the way people think about and participate in politics. So why should deindustrialization be politically consequential? So we've talked about the phenomenon in general, but why should it be so consequential for politics? So what's happened is that deindustrialization occurred temporally and spatially in an uneven way. It didn't happen and expose all people similarly, but the way that it was unevenly distributed across social groups made it experienced an exposure to this phenomenon, and the negative or consequences, or even the possible positive consequences, were not distributed equally. And so what happened is that is what's politically consequential, right? Because when there's a systematic social differentiation, so what happens is systematic social differentiation in political behavior occurs based on, this is a very early idea from sociology, from Larsefeld and his colleagues, even back to the 1940s, is something we've known for a long time, is that different social groups have different political behaviors and orientations, often due to a phenomenon when the consequences of the phenomenon, either materially or symbolically, or both, are different for different social groups. And that's exactly what's happening with deindustrialization, is that its unevenness across certain occupations and not others, certain families and not others, certain places and not others, is what makes it politically consequential. One of the main things that happens if we inspect really the consequences of how it's been unevenly distributed, what comes out very strongly is uneven spatial distribution. And this is not surprising given the fact that there was already an original spatial, local, regional spatial distribution in industrial production. The areas were very specialized in certain industries. And so when deindustrialization occurred in certain industries at certain different times, there was a distinct spatial pattern which happened in this process, which made people experience it really in their small area where they lived, either their community. In certain towns, for instance, in England, from one town that has an aerospace focus, the next town over had a ceramic production, and that's simply a feature of industrial societies. So the fact that ceramics got offshored at a different time than aerospace, which was subsidized by the UK government, that meant that locally the experience was different regarding deindustrialization. Another phenomenon, of course, is the fact that it's affected Europe, not just the United States or or continental Europe, not just the United States and the UK, which gets considerable attention in research. This is the regional experience. This was one of our maps that's come out of our initial findings of trying to map the evolution. This is the percentage of industrial employment in Europe across European regions. And what we see here is that almost all European regions, there are some small exceptions, but almost all regions have undergone a moderate to substantial decline in industrial employment. There are some regions which have been very affected, right? We know them: West Midlands, Noord-Pas-de-Calais, some Noord-Holland in Netherlands, or Limburg in Belgium, that have been, lost more than 60% of their industrial employment over the period. But what we see is a strong regional pattern, that there's a substantial degree of regional variation. Not in all countries, but certain countries. The UK is an exception, where the decline has been quite considerable across all the country. But many countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, Italy, have this regional pattern to it. Part of the project will be, of course, to go deeper, to go at a more specific geographic level, where we will actually examine the local areas, go quite deeper. We are still in the, let me just, okay. This is something that we're now working on, going at the local level in the United States. Now, here we have similar, looking at the evolution of industrial employment, so the number of actual jobs. This is using business registry data, which is, I'll speak a little bit later about what we're trying to do with our database. But what we would like to do, and what you can see from here, is we don't necessarily see, this is still a work in progress, but for now, this is what we've come up with, because some of the counties which are gray will be populated with missing information for now. But what we see already in the picture emerging is this quilted patchwork of local level deindustrialization, that it isn't necessarily this big rust belt that comes out when you look at the state level, but that within the states is a very different exposure to this phenomenon, to varying degrees, depending exactly on, probably very much determined to industrial life and what it was like. So the spatial distribution of this is extremely local. So what I would like to say is that the overall framework for the project, but really for the research agenda, is basically shown in a visual way here. So it's this way of conceptualizing manufacturing decline or deindustrialization as its own social context, and that as a context affects people behavior in several ways. So the unified framework is shown here. So I'll just walk you through it, because it's not always so intuitive. It starts really from the notion that manufacturing decline is more acute for some social groups than for others. That's the main notion underpinning this. And then it largely depends on two things. One is the social class that a person belongs to, and the other thing is where a person lives geographically. And in essence, this stratifies the experience of manufacturing decline. And that's what drives this social stratification and this was due because of the existing stratification of manufacturing work to certain social classes and certain places. And so when there is a decline in manufacturing production or industrial production, the people who are more acutely affected by it can occur through three channels. The first is through the occupational channel. This is the channel that receives the most attention, right? So people who are factory workers, or who lose their jobs, or who face economic uncertainty because of their occupation. And this can affect people's attitudes, voting, or various political behaviors, what party they choose for, whether they vote, what they think about their political system. But this is, let's say, the part that's been most researched. But the part that we were trying to really reveal that has been done less research are the parts which are touched by the long shadow, but who are not necessarily touched by this occupational. So people who live in communities because of where they live, who are affected by this process simply through community exposure, or people who are touched through this process, not because of the jobs they hold, but because of the families they grow up in, whether or not as adults they work in working class jobs, perhaps they had a working class father, or perhaps it's the spouse of a working class factory worker who lost a job, who then has to enter the labor market and get a low paying service job. All of those ripple effects are also felt through the family, and that they on their own have their own impact on political behavior. I'll just like to say something about the findings that we have so far. So like I mentioned, our project is really at the beginning of everything of our findings. So we do have some working papers and some initial findings. So I'll just briefly summarize what we've been finding so far and then just mention where we're headed. So one of the papers that we have is about the relationship and the extent to which the decline of the industrial sector as a context has disrupted the relationship that ordinary citizens have with democracy, and in particular, their attitude and their satisfaction level with their democratic system. Okay, so what we try to do is to investigate whether there's this relationship between regional deindustrialization and citizen satisfaction with democracy. We do this over a 25-year period across European regions, which is part of the map that I showed, the regions which are shown in the map that I showed you previously. And what our study demonstrates is that there's a negative relationship between economic restructuring or manufacturing decline and citizen satisfaction with democracy. To explain this, what we argue is that deindustrialization disrupts a very long pre-existing social contract that existed between citizens and democracy, because democracy came about alongside industrialization. And what did was it entangled these dual processes where citizens began to expect, and just simply came to expect, that democracy, a good democracy would use its policy instruments to foster an economy which protected good production jobs in industry, and that and also good pay, that these kinds of jobs and this types of employment was part of what good democracies were supposed to protect those jobs. No, so these expectations became embedded inside the polity, regardless. So what we find is that this contextual effect happens regardless of whether a person has a working class occupation or working class background. It just has a matter to do with geographic exposure. And so the idea is that why would it affect someone if personally and materially it doesn't affect them, is because watching it happen around them violated what one would expect democracy to do and reduce the satisfaction through this. The second paper that's come out is something a little bit different, which looks at the role of the family. So this is a study of political behavior, of working class families, of political behavior through 3 biological generations. So grandfather or grandparent, child, and then their children and their political behavior. And it looks at the way that having a working class grandfather affects the political behavior of their offspring and their offspring's offspring. In a very rare study that using very rare data from the United States, which tracks the political behavior of these generations. And so in this longitudinal study, which goes from the 1960s through the late 1990s, a 30-year span of time, what we find is that respondents who grew up in working class families, so had a working class father, regardless of those, whether or not they as adults in the 70s and 80s went to go on to have working class jobs, so even those that didn't, still had political behaviors that mimicked and were similar to the working class origins that they had. In this case, we were interested in political participation, so whether or not a person voted. So from a sociological perspective, it's a little bit different than political science, which cares very much which party a person votes for. In our paper, in this paper, we're interested in even non-voting, so alienation from the political system, non-voting. So working class people were traditionally less likely to vote. Labor unions helped encourage this vote, but they were less likely to vote. And the likelihood of voting in the second generation, even if they're not in working class occupations, is transmitted through a process of social reproduction because of family transmission. And what we find is that those individuals who are less likely, the second generation, to participate in politics, that behavior is then also transmitted to their offspring. And so what we see, and what we see it from this study, so how can we relate it back to the larger research agenda, is that manufacturing decline, of course, erodes this economic structure very rapidly. But the working, and so one could say, okay, if we just look at working class today, like how do they vote? Is it different? Do they vote at all? Because the snapshot of who is the working class today is a very small percentage of the people, but who have had exposure to the working class through their generational history are many more people than we usually look at if we think about the working class today, who's working in a working class occupation today. And that social structures through family reproduction of political behavior embedded those behaviors. And that means that it's almost like that means that the change is sticky. So the change might be very rapid economically, but social life and social adaptation is much slower. And so there's a lag because of the fact that part of these habits and behaviors are embedded inside social life, inside families, and reproduction of those behaviors occurs in families. They don't necessarily mimic the same rapid or occur or react in the same rapid form as the economic part. And I'm aware of the time, so I'll just conclude by talking about our future directions of the project. So we are currently, one of the big things that we're doing right now is building the database for the project, which will then allow us to do further analysis. The main source of data for our project is administrative data. So we'll be working on with business registry data to try to create local level measures of deindustrialization. So at the county level and very local, small geographic measures that don't just look at the number of people who are employed, which is typically done through labor market surveys, but to actually see how many plants closed, how many jobs were available in industry in a local area, and how well were they paid. And that will be for 3 countries, primarily due to data availability. So it will be the US, UK, and Germany. We're aiming for up to a 50-year period. We may not have to be able to do that in all 3 countries, but the idea is to try to encapsulate this in almost in a historical way over the full deindustrial period. And then this will be linked to longitudinal panel data, which follows the same individuals and the same families and their political behaviors. So how they feel about their political system, do they trust their political system? Do they feel they have a say in their political system? Do they choose to vote? How do they feel identifying themselves in the political arena? And that will be geographically linked to the local level data. So we will be able to see how local level affects people over the course of their life, whether they're socialized in certain contexts or not. And so this will be something we'll be working on for years, quite honestly. But that's where we're going from here, is to really link these 2 pieces together to try to get at the political consequences of this long shadow of deindustrialization and all the collateral damage or ripple effects, which are often overlooked in traditional political science studies, which focus mainly on a person's current occupation and who's working class today, not all of the people who have been touched by this. And with that, I'll just conclude and thank you for listening to me. And I'm looking forward to any of your questions to maybe elaborate further.
All right, thank you very much, Anne-Marie, for this really insightful talk on many levels. I mean, I felt it was great how you connected your data to your personal experience, or your personal experience to your data, but also pointing out, of course, that that this personal dimension is kind of an integral part, not just yours, but in general, an integral part of this data. And I, without wanting to jump ahead in the discussion, I think this mixing of levels, let's say, I think is what's really interesting here, for aggregate data and individual analysis and family level analysis. But as I said, I don't want to jump ahead here. I would rather like to open the floor to everyone else. So if you want to ask a question, make a comment, please put a little plus in the chat, and I'll call you up. Okay, let's start with Sebastian Hompot, please.
So, hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I'm a PhD candidate in Chinese studies. I'm especially interested in the US-China relations, and but also I would like to ask some questions related more to the domestic politics of the US. So I believe that during the Trump presidency and before the election of Donald Trump, so the mainstream media report, let's say, was often simplistic and reductionist in many ways. So of course I would not like to endorse Donald Trump here or say that I support him altogether, but I believe that these reasons, what you described here in detail, they might shed some light on the longer term reasons behind why he could be so popular in many segments of the US society. So I'm interested in what is your opinion on this? And also about the present and the future. What I kind of feel like is that like Biden, since he came to power, seems to in many ways constitute a kind of a continuity with the Trump era, at least when it comes to the policy on China, on protectionism against China. So what do you think about this, and how do you see the current trends and perspectives of the Biden era? Thank you.
Shall I answer one by one, Yanis, or we collect?
For now, you can answer one by one.
Okay. So this is a question I get a lot, which is because I think that it's an important topic and people really would like to connect it to populism and to electoral outcomes like the Trump election winning, when Trump won the election, or when Brexit happened. And I do feel that this research will, it's like that was an earthquake, and this is a research that looks at how the tectonic plates were shifting. So it is important, I think. And I think, though, that what comes out of the research so far is the working class, the people who actually do routine working class occupations, are not necessarily the main Trump supporters, because they tend to actually be alienated and not vote at all. The people who identify with the working class, but who are actually middle class, so this is about self-identification, not actually what occupations people do, or who are middle class, or who maybe have that geographic exposure, who are in places that have been deindustrialized, may have been more likely to vote for Trump. Trump's actual success isn't something that's being studied by us in the research agenda. But I can say that from what the research shows is that working class individuals, the people who keep on working class jobs, are very disillusioned with politics, feel betrayed, but they feel futile. So what tends to happen so far is mainly a withdrawal rather than the bitter Trump supporter that came out of the narrative. Having said that, that's a broad generalization. If we think a little bit about the mob on Washington, those are affluent people who identify with the working class, but they are affluent Americans. They have like good jobs and they have a lot of money and resources, but they are politically motivated. So I think there's this idea of associating and identifying with the working class, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those are the individuals actually that are mobilized politically. In terms of the Biden and the broader protectionist policies of the United States, I don't really have anything from our research. Our research actually ends in 2015, even before the Trump election. So the research that we have doesn't really shed a lot of light on it. And I think this has to do with an unfortunate part of quantitative research, which is there's a lag in data availability and research tends to lag real life, so we might have to wait many years to actually have any solid conclusions about the Biden administration. So I wouldn't want to speculate too much about what that is. But certainly Biden's electoral coalition, the types of social groups which he was managed to put together in order to win the election in these typically rusted places, and Biden's own relationship as a working class Democrat, with certainly probably had a role in identifying with these groups, which maybe might have been more marginalized. But beyond that, it's hard to say at this point, mainly because as academics, we lag so much the contemporary political debates.
Right, thank you very much. Our next question is from Lin Nguyen. Lin, please.
Hello, my name is Tuklin Min Wu, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here. And thank you so much for this really interesting and very clear talk. And I have a very simple question that actually might be a bit more sophisticated than that, but what are the limits of deindustrialization? How do we define it, and how do we define its contours, especially when we want to use that as an explanation to kind of certain choices, political choices of citizens, members of the society, simply because because you have this kind of transgenerational research, right? So how can we say that a grandchild of someone who experienced directly the industrialization, how can we establish this causal relationship between what the grandparents experience and the contemporary life of the grandchild? I'm not saying that there is no explanation there, but perhaps I would need kind of a bit more of a clarification. How can we grasp that, and how can we use that to formulate an argument that will explain some of these choices? Is there a limit to the industrialization? Can there be other factors that actually overpowered the experience of deindustrialization that push given voters to vote in a certain way? And my second question is a bit of a minor one, because you said here that deindustrialization does not happen evenly, doesn't happen horizontally. And I thought about, how should I understand, and I'm not an expert here, the fact that, someone did not experience deindustrialization, but lives in a place that has been deindustrialized, and this shapes that person's life immediately, in comparison to someone whose the whole family lost their jobs in the wake of changing the labor relations, but yet that person lives in a completely different place where there are no marks of deindustrialization in the cityscape. So this kind of space versus immediate personal experience, is it enough to say that these are just diverse ways of experiencing deindustrialization, or do we need some kind of a hierarchy or maybe relationships between these two ways to explain it more? Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was very great questions. Very complex, actually, but really great, and to also get me thinking about these issues. Where are the contours? I'll start with the first one, which is so important. What are the contours of deindustrialization? in the context of the project, we try to define deindustrialization as three things, like a closure of actual manufacturing and industrial establishments, like the actual places of work, so a factory that closed, the number of jobs in a local area, so the number of jobs that are in that sector, and then third, how well paid are those jobs. So that's how we try to quantify the actual phenomenon in a narrow sense, but give it, let's say, more dimensions than is usually given. The notion, as you say, is how do you know what is important? Is it the individual personal experience of material loss? I probably would say that there probably is a hierarchy, right? Individual experience of material loss, whether it's losing a job or a household that loses income, is probably very significant. But there is also this hidden part, the diffuse effect through geography or larger kin networks or socialization, which is naturally, I would say, perhaps less shocking, but maybe equally important in a person's orientation. Regarding the difficulty to track through generations, the impact through generations on people's political behavior. I should be more precise about this, and I didn't go into enough detail when I explained this, is that the main transmission is not necessarily in the grandchild. There's a remnant transition in the grandchild, is from parent to child. So really that's that middle generation that has this low voting pattern, and the person's parental occupation, a person's parental working class occupation predicts the fact that they will not vote much less, even if regardless of that person's own occupation and regardless of their parents' general behavior in terms of voting. So that is more strong. When we get to the third generation, what happens is not that the grandfather having a working class job is what matters. It's the fact that their parent, who was the son of an industrial worker, let's say, didn't work as much. One of the main predictors of whether a person will vote in an election is whether the parent voted in an election. This is like just generally in political science and in sociology, is one of the biggest predictors of political behavior is parental political behavior. So if your parent voted, you're very likely to also be a voter, be a participant in politics. That's one of the biggest factors. So when deindustrialization happens, what happens is people say, well, class doesn't matter in political life. Class is over. We live in post-industrial societies. Class doesn't matter anymore. And what this paper is trying to do is saying that class matters in a more indirect way because it continues to operate through the transmission of parental behaviors. So today a person can not be working class, but if they had working class background with certain kinds of political behaviors which occurred in those political subcultures, it continues to live on and be reproduced through that family. So I hope that's a more subtle way to think about it rather than a direct effect. And it really has to do with what's the most important factor in people's political participation. It really is the family socialization, that the parent that has a relationship, and that's why it matters how it gets reproduced. I hope I've answered all of the questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I put myself next on the list. My question has to do with well, with this issue of classes and sort of explanatory factor here, which I think is, I agree with you that it's very important. And coming from migration history, migration studies myself, there I'm always among the ones who would say, well, we shouldn't just talk about immigrant backgrounds, we should talk about class backgrounds much more. Now I'm going to ask you the opposite questions, but since you brought it up yourself, that deindustrialization is not just a white thing, it affected African Americans in the US and Latinos. In Germany, it disproportionately affected the so-called guest workers. So there is a strong sort of immigrant/minority component to that. And I wanted to ask you to what extent this factors into your analysis, and if so, how you do that. And if not, why not?
So thank you for the question, Yanis, and it connects also, I have most of my research before was on migration, so it connects a bit of the two processes. And the case of Germany is particularly interesting. So one of the offshoots of the project will be it's like a sub-project, which I've received some different funding source, will be to particularly examine the experience of women as spouses, as daughters, and also as workers in their various gender roles in de-industrialized life, because they were cross-pressured, because they, at the same time of de-industrialization affected their working class women, at the same time they got this, like culturally were given a lot more freedoms in the labor market. So they had this dual phenomenons that they navigated during those years. When it comes to minorities, at the moment, one of the struggles with minorities is naturally the small number of observations. They are minorities, so they have such a small number of observations of their political behaviors in these data sets, which make it very difficult to really follow them. There might be an opportunity really to follow it in Germany, where the SOP has this like large like extra of foreigners, which might be really interesting. Especially in the European context. I maybe hadn't given it enough thought in Europe, and was thinking more about the Black-white issues in the United States. So at the moment, let's put it this way, ethnicity or foreign citizen or ethnic minority isn't really a focus in the design of the project, but let's say it's something that's always there. And this idea of Germany, I really like that a lot. I think actually I might investigate it a little more after you've given me this idea about guest workers, also because the timing of the guest workers was from the 1970s when they arrived. So yeah, it's part of one of the myths. It's one of the myths we don't spend as much time busting, but probably should. So thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, well, I'm not gonna dwell on this. I have many more ideas there, but I'm sure we can exchange some ideas also in a different format. Let's continue with Janos Kovac right
now. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. Just listening to your presentation, I realized that you are basically using very gloomy categories. You talk about a social bad. De-industrialization is, for you, if I understand well, is a social bad. You were using terms like damage, crisis, victims of de-industrialization, earthquake, things like that. Now my question is about the advantages of de-industrialization. Do you also study this in this project? You know, not just environmental things and working environment things, retraining, becoming small entrepreneurs, relocation, which has also certain advantages. So will your study be a little bit, how to say, more balanced in terms of the virtues and vices of the industrialization? This is the first question. The second is, if the industrialization is bad, is re-industrialization good? And if it is good, in what terms, in what style? What kind of industry should be put there where industries are eradicated, eliminated, liquidated? So that is the second question. And the third is about democracy. So it is probably clear that these people are fed up with representative democracy, and they are waiting for the populist leader who is stepping over the ruins of representative democracy. But one could also imagine that they would be interested in some kind of direct democracy, participational democracy. Now that is my question. If you are just studying voting patterns, then you would not see, I mean, a probable emergence of some kind of social movements, which would work against the industrialization, at least against the vices of the industrialization. So my question is whether this simplistic syllogism that the de-industrialization breeds skepticism over democracy. Cannot it be nuanced and by saying that, yes, maybe, but probably direct democracy might flourish on the ruins of representative democracy? So these were my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. The first one is very important about the normative way of framing deindustrialization, which actually one should perhaps even be more I should be more circumspect in the way that I say it, because there's a phenomenon which is known as smokestack nostalgia, right? Where there is this idea that this is somehow a bad phenomenon, and there's a wish that this hadn't happened. One of the things that really, there's another part of the project that's now grown as an offshoot is exactly about where does this nostalgia for industrial life come from and who actually has it. Some of these jobs, which are typically spoken about today as good jobs, were not actually that good jobs. They were dangerous jobs, they were repetitive jobs, they were people risked their lives on these jobs. Are these the jobs that we wish to return to? And what's interesting, though, for me as a sociologist, is not to say whether we should return to them or this is a good or a bad process, but rather to say, why is it seen that way? Why is there a nostalgia for this way of life, the community of life that went along with it, the camaraderie that went along with the production line? What was the stability, the material stability that came with it, regardless of the routine tasks associated with a Fordist mode of production? So I don't have any, I don't expect to really study any policy implications for reindustrialization, except to perhaps use the phenomenon of reindustrialization, just use it as a counterfactual for what's uncovered with deindustrialization. In that sense, it's an interesting counterfactual. And there are areas which have had reindustrialization, such as downtown Los Angeles, amongst many others. In terms of the relationship with democracy, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is a sort of like problematic for representative democracy, whether or not using direct democracy tools can help people feel more involved and feel this crisis of democratic satisfaction. There's a whole area of political scientists who try to study this. From the perspective of deindustrialization, I'm not sure, just because of this problem of lack of participation and alienation, which has come and embedded itself in some of the traditions, where it isn't necessarily that people even feel it is worthwhile to go to the ballot box because of a sense of futility and a low locus of control. So one of the reasons why social class is an important structuring of political participation is with people who work in those types of occupations. So why is it that social class even determines how you participate in politics? Those types of occupations structure people's ways of thinking about the world because it's the actual job they do. And they tend to be occupations which offer individuals a very low locus of control over their own occupation. And this goes back to the basics of sociology and Weber and Durkheim. But what happened in these professions is people just feel they have a low locus of control. They have a little impact on their life, on the direction of their life, on the mobility chances, on what is within their purview. And then that spills over to their political participation. Well, what's the point in voting? Politicians don't care about ordinary people. Besides then also time and financial resources on participating in politics. So direct democracy, if we're talking, and this has to be also validated in the project, really about a politically alienated group, might not work if there's already this participatory gap where they would decline to participate. Maybe it is an instrument that can galvanize them, but given this is a group that has been kind of like, because of also the nature of work, the lack of political knowledge that's accumulated on the job, the different kinds of worldviews which occur at these kinds of occupations, it might not be even that offering tools, which in theory, rationally would offer more control, might not be that actually, I don't know, something to study. It's definitely an interesting thing to ponder. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Then we have another question by Maria Bichkova, please. Or not. Seems like we have lost her from the list of participants, so that's a bummer. Okay, so anyone else at this point who would like to ask a question to Anne-Marie or comment on the presentation?
Philip wants to talk.
Yeah, well, I don't want to talk. I'm waiting for other people to talk.
Well, but if nobody
else is popping up a question at the moment, I have one which is about, since you do this comparative study, Paul Collier wrote this book about, the title was The Future of Capitalism, but in many ways, the book was about the past of capitalism and welfarism. And one of his main theories was, I would say, you can say, mainstream, I would say, former or maybe still social democratic, but rather, moderate left political scientist. One of his findings was what really destroyed the working class was not just the loss of jobs, but then the welfarism which came after, pertaining to England, Sheffield and other places. So his argument basically is that there is a lack of reciprocity, that in the former life, people delivered their work, however hard and unpleasant it might have been. There was a give and take and a sense of responsibility and also a sense of community spirit. And he argues that, well, then came the welfare state trying to compensate for that. And that's how I understood his book. In many ways, it made it worse because it dished out benefits, but not expecting anything for the benefits. And he doesn't argue against the benefits, but what he's saying is that this destroyed the self-esteem of the working class because they got something for which they didn't have to deliver anything anymore. That's how I understood the book. Maybe it might be simplistic, but anyway, what I wanted to ask you is, when you have now this comparative panel, you're having some deindustrialized areas where you still have a strong welfare state and welfarism, and you have other areas where you have, less welfarism. I mean, you don't have Eastern Europe in your panel. But anyway, there, of course, the difference would be also quite remarkable. In deindustrialized countries where you don't have, buffers like you had in the Strukturwandel in Western Europe, in Germany, Belgium, and so on, the state coming in and trying to buffer it. But this is, well, anyway, this is already leading to another direction, right? This kind of attempts of the state to change the structures. Let's maybe stay with the welfarism, at least for now, and whether you can discover any effects of that in your comparative cases. Does it have an impact? And of course, we could ask the same question about state-run attempts to mitigate the effects of deindustrialization and to build up alternative new economic structures. Whether that had any impact, positive ones. So these would be, it has added up to 2 questions. Sorry, I only wanted to ask one. And then let's hope that Maria Bichkova can be back. I always interrupt.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting point, which is how much can the welfare state or the state in general compensate politically people for this? And does that then mean that the political consequences are different? I'll just say something very briefly about the comparative design. So because of the different data sources, this is not really a comparison quantitatively between UK, Germany, and US, but is rather 3 separate subnational comparative studies, because we are studying differences across the local levels. So we can see whether we can confirm similar patterns in countries, but we can't really quantitatively compare them. But it does offer something, Collier's argument on welfarism and the reason that you outlined nicely about the effect on the working class really brings home this fact that it's a cultural shift and the moral shift. There's something about the moral values that changed, which you mentioned reciprocity, but often other people mention true grit as a kind of hard work, the ethics which were embedded in working class subculture, which were no longer able to be like affirmed through the system. I think that the story of welfarism in the UK is particular to the UK because the way the welfare state is structured is in a way where there's a great social stigma to accept welfare. It's a means-tested system, unlike a Bismarckian or universal system. And it's a kind of residual system, so it's seen as a handout. And so then it was, like you say, even more humiliating for people to accept it with this stigma. So what I would just say is that certainly what you mentioned is very interesting, is like, how do these different policies mitigate or the actual political impact? I hope we can actually explore that. Some of the data actually has information on what kind of benefits people actually receive in the data. So we could even look at that as a mitigating factor. And I thank you for that, because I think that is an important piece. It's not a uniform experience, and it's something to consider. Certainly the mitigation techniques were oriented towards the people who were directly materially affected, the people who actually lose their jobs, less so for that long shadow, the ripple effects, of course. And that might be one of the reasons why there was even more political consequences, because there were just simply, they were not offered any assistance, and these were less tangible material losses that the state didn't compensate in any way. I guess that would be my first instinct before analyzing. But I thank you for those ideas, because I think that those are important to explore.
Okay, thank you. There are no new people on the list, so in that case, I would like to ask you another question. Kind of building on what Philip just said, that Eastern Europe is not within your sample, of course. Well, of course, I don't know. It's not part of your sample. But I was wondering if you could at least sort of hypothetically think about Eastern Europe and the implications of what happened there. I mean, here we're talking about de-industrialization starting from the 1970s, as you showed very nicely in this graph. And in socialist Eastern Europe, we basically have, this structural change did not happen to the same extent during this period of time, because these industries were sustained. They were also subsidized and sustained in Germany, for instance. The coal industry, of course, also received its fair share or unfair share of subsidies. But in any case, there's a different political context in which these industries were kept alive and then disappeared much more rapidly. And I wonder if you could think about the differential impact that this sort of, if you shock de-industrialization, if you want to call it that, though of course you would have to differentiate by country and sector, etc. But shock de-industrialization versus this slow fading away of these industries. And of course, you mentioned that this aggregate picture, of course, then is very different, differentially distributed in space, etc. But still, thinking on the aggregate level at least, if this would yield different results.
Yes, so the topic is of great interest to me. There's only really one reason that I didn't make it part of the project, was that I'm not an expert on that part. I felt that one had to really know very well those political regimes and those systems to be able to comment. But was always remained really burning in my mind. We have Germany, and we have East and West Germany, and that was something that I hope to explore in the context of Germany. But I still, it always is kind of like in the back of my mind, this idea that while in the West part of Europe experienced industrialization and democratization at a similar time, the Central and East experienced democratization along with deindustrialization. And that this is like a whole new way of also particularly related to the nostalgia piece, where there might be some nostalgia for a time when there were jobs like that and under a different political regime. Certainly, when we look at democratic satisfaction, there's not anecdotally, descriptively, this crisis of democratic satisfaction, which is now coming to a head in these countries where democracy has not delivered what it promised. What it was promising, one isn't quite sure, but certainly not delivering what people expected. And the extent to which that might be related to industrialization, I think, is really important. So my simple explanation was that given the data that we have, we probably will explore something that compares East and West Germany. But certainly this emptiness, and also there are these places in Central and Eastern Europe where whole towns became depopulated, where people just left, and there's like an absence even of population, which occurred in an extreme way due to deindustrialization. So the experiences, even in some cases, have been very extreme. And I certainly think it's worth studying. But I think that those political regimes, at least from my perspective, required someone who has quite a bit of an expertise on those regimes, which I don't have, or would have to accumulate to do it. But it's still so interesting.
Philip.
Well, if you don't have any other people asking, then Maria Bichkova, I see maybe she lost the connection. Sometimes that happens with Zoom meetings, especially if people have a bad internet. And that has to do, it's in a way a follow-up question. We had a research project in Vienna and in Regensburg pertaining to shipyards. And actually, socialist and post-socialist, late socialist and post-socialist. And there basically the finding was, well, what people perceive as kind of loss of what the industrial work gave them was a rhythm of life and shop floor community. Shop floor community. One of the reasons being because there was such a, planned economy didn't function, and so they had to improvise a lot, and that gave them a large amount of autonomy on the shop floor basis, forging the group in an additional way, and maybe even forging more of a community than in Western Europe. However, we also found out that actually there were people moving out of industrial work. So there was kind of a deindustrialization from below in a way. You had usually the first generation moving into industry under Stalinism, and that was really a social advance. A second generation moving on in the 70s, but then people rather were going for white-collar jobs, so we're not so adamant anymore about industrial jobs. So even before '89, the young generation was not so keen anymore of moving into industry. But however, even if they entered late, they had this recollection of a sense of life and community in a way, or structuring life and community. Now my question is, and because you had this personal take on your grandmother, what is missing in the service economy? I mean, why is it that, so to say, the working class in the service sector, I think it is always relative. What are they missing? What they got in industry? Any clue?
That's a very important question, because looking at the decline in production employment or manufacturing employment is only one side of the coin, because the other side is the rise of service, and what are the political consequences of that. And that's something we wrestle with, and it's certainly very important to understand. And I should say that there are different ways of defining like working class jobs. And some people say that even some routine service jobs are still one thing is to say, okay, we're going to hold the occupational structure the same as it was in the 1960s and compare the same occupations. Other people, sociologists can go on and defining what is working class based on occupations. Another way is to say, okay, some of these things are now in the service sector, but they are still quote unquote working class jobs. The chambermaids that clean the hotel rooms, the domestic care workers, the waitresses, anything that involves like, or even clerical work that's routine, office work, anything that's routine and kind of like involves low automation. Could they be considered still working class in a way? They're just doing different things than used to be done. So I guess that answer to that question is really about, I think that there's definitely this issue of pride and moral values that were embedded in industrial work. And to be honest, I think that they've also, the moral values have gotten higher as the work disappears with this concept of nostalgia. But the service economy still has occupational hierarchy and still has routine jobs, and the COVID times have highlighted this issue of essential workers to a greater extent than before, where we see that there were people who can't be automated, who can't be offshored, who need to work to keep our economy going, and they do these routine jobs, and they are in some way still a working class. And so I think in that sense, and that's keeping up with the sociological literature and the contemporary way of thinking about working class today. So I suppose in that sense, those jobs, of course, are not well paid, not very stable, precarious, not unionized, etc. So I suppose the stability has changed along with the actual occupations. The actual work that's being done is different. And I definitely think that all of this is connected to the value of producing something you can actually hold, the hard work, producing something rather than doing the care and the cleaning and the serving. But I don't know. And I think that's something we're always going to be wrestling with. Like we're looking at one side of the pancake, and what about the other side? It's an important part of the project, I think, that we'll continue to think about. And thank you for sharing the insights about the shipyards. That's very, very interesting, because some of those qualitative insights are important for the project to investigate, because the quantitative literature and the quantitative work on this really lags all the rich insights from the qualitative. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, you opened up this whole Pandora's box of categories now, and of course, now we won't go into this in the next 5 minutes. But I mean, this is something I've been struggling with myself when working with German census or the micro census, where you have these categories of secondary and tertiary sectors. And you're like, this tertiary sector, the service sector, is really in many ways a meaningless category, because it comprises both comfortable white collar jobs and the Amazon driver and the care worker and so on and so on. And there are massive differences. perhaps in working, or well, in working class too, of course, but of course the industrial jobs that remain also have changed. I mean, I'm thinking of my hometown, to share some experience there too, where there's really one big factory where a lot of people work, and those used to be good jobs. But now the people who work there are all on precarious contracts, basically. I mean, there are some who are left with the good contracts from the past, and there are the others who all work on basically also through these they're loaned out from other firms, etc. So you have a hierarchy even within what could be defined as working class. But I mean, this is obviously, I guess, if you're looking at aggregate numbers in particular, at some point you have to move away from, or like, yeah, to a more abstract level in a sense. But still, it's the issue of categories is just daunting, I guess. Now, if you
Yeah,
I mean,
I
yeah.
hope what we will be able, there's two kinds of categories. There's the industry categories and the occupational categories, and both have been restructured. So the thing that you're talking about is the hollowing out of the labor market, the polarization of occupations and the skill in the service sector, where there's like high paying jobs and low pay service sector and high pay service sector. So that's the occupational dimension. And we are primarily looking at the industry dimension, but they're both part of the story. So the struggle, or let's say the challenge for us, is to try to find both parts of the puzzle where they intersect, which, given the fact that they've been totally changed over the last 50 years, is, as you say, kind of a nightmare in terms of categories. So we deal with that on a regular basis, but it's part of it is the story of both.